Dana and Marco. Dana is a writer, and he's co-signed the book Memories and Misunderstanding with Jim Carrey. He's one of the, I think, in this moment, persons more close to Jim. And Marco is a critic, film critic, a memoirist, and they are here to speak about this character. You can call it like that.
The one we spoke to him last night, and he said the one message I have for everyone is that we are all the same being, and he's in a very good place, and he's exploring that shared being. So he's here with us, and he's all of us, which means he's the three of us. So you guys got 3 for 1. Marco and I were saying, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And that presents 3 versions of Jim Carrey.
3 versions of Jim Carrey. And that presents challenges for a memoir, right? Which memoirs deal in fixed identity.
Yes.
And I remember when I first met Jim, we had the same manager who put us together, and I went into his art studio in the West Village, and he'd been doing paintings of his recent experience, and there was a self-portrait that had been cut and stitched back together, and there were fires in Los Angeles. He painted the Malibu fires, which are now such a part of life with climate change. And I was saying to Marco today that I thought of the scene in the Aeneid where Aeneas goes to the temple of Aphrodite in Libya, and he sees all of the paintings of Troy in flames, and he cries, the tears for things, right? That wonderful line, there are tears of things, and human things touch the heart. And from my perspective, I mean, it's not my memoir, it's our novel, it's Jim's memoir. But for me, there was an undertaking of understanding what had happened to the narrative to get to that place. And that was the beginning of a 10-year journey.
So actually, Dana went from the Aeneid to the Odyssey with Jim Carrey.
That's right. That's exactly right.
It was 10 years.
During which a lot changed. I think, Carrey's a great artist, so there's always a feed-forward element. I think America was falling apart. A certain high American narrative that had involved Jim Carrey, right? I mean, unified being is a double-edged thing. It's wonderful in a sense that we can escape ourselves from a Buddhist perspective, but when society jackknifes, we're all part of the jackknifing. And so we began to write this book, which then is an apocalyptic memoir.
What year, remind everyone what year you actually started writing.
I've forgotten, but my best guess is 2011.
Okay.
And then it becomes an apocalyptic novel, which you've just read. And Marco's a great memoirist from America who had a similar forensic undertaking with a memoir about his family. So I thought that this would be a good conversation because at around the same, well, you published in 2011.
2013.
13. Oh, so actually at around the same time, we're going on a similar journey. Do you want to talk about how yours began?
Well, mine actually had no such lovely classical order. Things did not happen in 10-year, perfectly chronic intervals. I mean, I think what's funny to me about this, I mean, as a panel, I mean, Dana and Jim wrote a work of fiction which is completely true to themselves and reveals something of the essence of Jim Carrey, and it's amazing. Sometimes you can only do this through fiction, and in my case, what I had to do was I had the memoir is called The Scientists, a family romance, and it's about the myths that we inherit from our family, and also that in my particular case, what happened is my father, who is a rigorous scientist and a hematologist, and in many ways a lover of art, but in no way thought of himself as playing a role, or he clung to an idea of objective truth and scientific truth and honesty. An event happened in his life, which is he got the HIV virus, and he, as a result of that, became a mythomaniac, and imposed a romance on our family, which we repeated and we learned, and it was the story that we took for the truth, and so we actually had a myth about what was going on, and in order to unpack this, it was not only did I write a book, but my aunt, my father's sister, who's a novelist, and was always regarded as the fabulist, as the person who makes things up, as the person who can't, if you asked her to describe something, she would always put something in that wasn't there, and this used to drive my father crazy. And but she decided that she also had to tell a true story, which in a way was a required correction. So I found myself holding these two family myths and split, because suddenly I was like, there has to be a true story in here, and there has to be a scientific truth or an absolute truth, and I went in search of this, and that process took me actually about 20 years. Before, from the first inkling of something being wrong to finally being able to tell the story in a way that felt true to me, and true to the writer that I wanted to be, and true to my father, and the human being that he was, in all aspects of himself, which also meant betraying him.
It's a gigantic undertaking, which I didn't realize. To unpack a single myth is a gigantic undertaking. So the parallel was that you are all Jim Carrey's family. And so the parallel of being a star is you have a true self, but you have one vote about the truth of yourself against 7 billion votes in the case of Jim Carrey in the minds of all of the other people. And you are going to become part of that when you watch the movie and see him playing Andy Kaufman, right? So how do you contend with that? And you have to get very creative in the form of the memoir. So yours is modeled as a detective story, as a literary detective story.
Yes. Yeah, and also because what I did was I went back and researched. There were books that my father had loved, and we were talking. You enjoyed this book, Oblomov, which I don't know if people know this. It's a 19th century Russian novel in which the main character takes the first 100 pages to get out of bed. And it's often read as a sociological novel about the ills of the Russian aristocracy and their congenital laziness. And my father, who is really not lazy, I was like, why did he love this? Like, what was this about? And it also turns out to be a book about shame, ultimately. But it took me, so that's that. I would go back in and look at the books that were staring me in the face. Some of which I was like, he had told me to read, and I hadn't read, or I read in a kind of pedantic, overly moralizing way that one reads when one is, an adolescent. And then I was like, oh, I have to read these again. But the Jim Carrey character does not get out of bed for quite some time.
There was a weird parallel because there were two goals of structuring. One is that Jim has his own theology that he can speak to in philosophy, but he was raised Catholic, and I was raised Catholic too. So there were two influences in the book, and one of them was Quixote, where you can read Don Quixote as a gospel of a saint, right, whose faith changes reality around him. And you can do the same thing with a French-Canadian boy who grows up manifesting an idea of stardom in a character and then becomes it, right? And that becomes an American saint. So I had two structural goals with the book. One of them was to make it almost like a cathedral, where with a cathedral you have vaulted structures, right, that are defying laws of physics. So for me, this was genre, but that allows you to then have the Stations of the Cross set as you please to show truth, or to the truth of Christ in that sense. And our goal with this book was to have bizarre genres. I mean, there's a movie about Mao Zedong in this book that never gets made, and only Jim Carrey would allow this. There's a big Hasbro production of Hungry Hungry Hippos that Carrey gets trapped in, but is secretly Gilgamesh. So these are, and then finally you have The End of the World, which, if you read the book correctly, might be just an apocalyptic movie that his managers have dealt his digital essence into. But along the way, Carrey was meticulous, and these were moments where I would give it over to him. We are going to set in, as our stained glass Stations of the Cross, we watched Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Your daughter had an amazing event at a penitentiary here. And that movie is about memory and the obliteration of memory, but one of the amazing stories of that memory is that the innermost circle of memory in that movie is the character that Jim plays going back and finding his childhood, and there's a green bicycle, a wide handlebarred lime green Mustang, which was, Carrie's family was quite poor, and he didn't have a bike. And there was a church raffle, and he wanted the bike, and he won the bike without buying a ticket, because he wanted it, he wished for it. And this was Carrie's assertion of magic in the world. And in a movie that at times can be very French and postmodern and bleak, at the heart of the movie is a statement of faith in magic. And those moments are throughout that book. I mean, it's deeply faithful, if you read it correctly, deeply faithful to his experience, but rejecting linearity, because the linear narrative goes to the mythos and the cult.
Yes.
And as you know, you have to tear that down before you can build up a new narrative.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, we were talking about this earlier, and people think of the memoir, especially now, especially in the U.S., as linked to this thing called identity. And you hear people be like, I found my identity, I found my voice. And in the case, I mean, I thought when I was writing my book that I had to sacrifice identity for integrity. And I feel like Dana and Jim do something similar in this book, where the reason this is a memoir is because it's a work of amazing integrity that actually shatters a concept of a beginning, middle, end identity that you can say, this is, as a French Canadian man, right? I mean, that kind of, it's not
a sentence that would never start Jim Carrey's memoir,
right? I was born as a French Canadian man, right? I mean, so the assertion of identity is absent.
It's actually funny you say that, because our great editor Gary Fisketjon at Knopf, when he acquired the book, we sent the book out, and there were people who wrote back, they were disturbed. I don't know what this is. Well, I don't know why you've sent this to me. And maybe like the greatest American fiction editor of his generation replied back, man, I love this. There's none of this, there's a town in North Ontario bullshit. Like a Neil Young song, right?
Yeah, so it's not an origin story.
It's not an origin story.
Yeah, but it's a kind of, but there's a myth in it. I mean, it's a creation myth, actually.
A recreation myth.
Yeah.
For a new world. And you and I always talk about world laws. I'm convinced Carrie sensed the thing before it happened. And we've been talking for a while about
The thing being COVID, or the thing being...
the end of High America, the end of the post-war.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
And when you say the end of the post-war, you're referring to Emmanuel Macron's line the other day about the peace in Europe.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Just to be clear. Just to be clear for people.
We've been traveling for 3 days, so we're trading in shorthand. But Macron famously said after Putin, you now have a war in Europe, and he said, just because the peace of 1945 didn't hold doesn't mean that everything's going to go to chaos. And the job of the great artist is to feed forward. Because I remember when I meet Carrie, and he's and he goes, if you ever just want to jabber, just call me. And I was like, okay, I'll never hear from that guy again. And like 2 weeks later, he calls, it's like 2 a.m, and he's watching the John Barrymore Jekyll and Hyde, which would really inform the book. So we sort of start chatting, but I don't produce anything for about a year. I'm writing a lot, but I don't have anything. And finally, I get a call from the agents. They're like, yeah, it's been a long time. He's getting a little nervous. I mean, you've taken his money. Where's the frickin' book? And I'm like, well, in good faith, I have two linear chapters at that point, which are him in bed, eating ice cream, watching Netflix, mainlining the entire tragic history of the human race on Netflix. And I'm like, look, the time's up. I got to send something in. I'm definitely going to die on this hill. But I'd rather go down with the work that I believe in and that I've done than try to go down full of shit. So I send it in, and 2 very charged days pass, and Jim calls and he goes, "This is really good. Keep going." That's a great artist.
But he told you what you had to do, in what direction you should go, or you do it just
We worked very slowly to find the foundation. I always think of writing a novel like writing a pyramid, where for the beginning of the construction of the pyramid, all your friends think you're making a square. right? They go out to the desert. They go, that guy's crazy. It's not a pyramid. It's a square.
Not to mention the slave labor involved.
And so we made the square, and then we sold the book on the square to two wonderful editors, and then we would work together. So, and that was a beautiful year and a half of creativity of Jim and I in the same room, or over Skype. He gave me a gorgeous. Jim's the greatest. He said to his assistant, find the typewriter F. Scott Fitzgerald had and get it to Dana. So one day for Christmas, a 1929 Underwood shows up, and I'm like, oh, this is like something that you could put maybe, I don't know, put a vase next to. I would never, like this is, someone has to give you your first typewriter. Jump cut, we sell the book, and the typewriter is perched in my windowsill in Park Slope, and I'm smoking, and he's on Skype, and we're going back and forth, and the typewriter was weirdly like an immunity cloak against digital media, because nobody can FaceTime you on a typewriter. And I think we only got the book done in time because of the typewriter. So there were these magical moments in the composition. There are many different phases.
That's a great story because it's a story about generosity, and there's something. I mean, and the book itself is so generous. I think that's something that should be said. It's like it's a weirdly like.
It's a portrait of a beautiful soul. I mean, one of the people read the book and they go, well, Nick Cage has all the best lines. And even Nick Cage said to Jimmy's like, man, like you gave me the best lines in the book. But Carrie's interest is not, I mean, many wonderful people, their ego would kick in at that point. Everything was in service of the final, and there was an amazing, in terms of generosity, like we had a 2-week writing session in Maui that he and I remembered. Where we weren't doing any work for about 2 weeks, but the David Ferry translation of the Aeneid had come out. A new translation of the Aeneid had come out, which had begun the project. We were just reading, and Maui sort of looks, it's like an archipelago kind of, so you could imagine that you're in the Aegean, and like, on day 12 or 13, we're like drinking red wine and talking about language and going back and forth with the sentence, which is the last sentence of the book. Which is when Carrie can't remember his name. He's been through the apocalypse and he's on a dinghy, and he says Jimmy Dinghy, Jim Dinghy, Jimsy Dinghy, Dinghy Jim, and the name, and that's when he's free. And so we always said, when you buy Bill Clinton's memoir, you're a candidate for a refund. Not only have you not gotten the story of Bill Clinton, but you've been lied to and made to believe that he's a decent person.
Yeah, well, this is also the whole culture of celebrity memoir, which is something that we discussed, right? I mean, which is that, in America, it's expected that Jared Kushner, who's barely a celebrity, but was the son-in-law of our former president, who shall not be named, was given $1 million not to write a book, because he never would write it. He would hire somebody whose name would never appear, and you would never know who this person is, who actually wrote the words of the memoir it's
part of
Jared
the
Kushner's memoir.
rebranding of a horrendous person, where Carrie uses his memoir to free everyone from the idea of the self, to obliterate the self, right? Like we're all part of a field of being that is glorious, and there's glory underlying all experience. It's anti-aristocratic. When you think of celebrity as aristocracy, it's an ecstatically heretical book, and she's just he's an incredibly generous, beautiful person.
You also had this great line earlier about the book is against what you call the Great American Shrug.
Oh, right.
Which is, I mean, if you want to understand American culture now, I mean, this phrase of Dana's really unlocks it, but he's going to have to explain it to you. What is the Great American Shrug?
When you point out something that's horrifically wrong with late American life, like the fact that Jared Kushner would get $1 million for a freaking novel after shaking down Cutter to bail out
a novel.
Or whatever. Sorry, it's definitely a novel. It's a work of fiction.
Yes.
Americans will greet you with, they go, it's just how it happened. It's just how it shook out. Someone has like the most beautiful apartment, and you're like, yeah, but like the guy like does slave labor, and they go, it's just how it's going. And I think we were proud of this book as being anti-shrug.
Yeah, it's very much not. You can't read this book and shrug.
That's right.
Yeah.
Chappelle, do you have any questions?
No, I'm just hearing. Go on, go on. I don't have any.
Or should we open it up to the?
And I
to the
think
audience?
Carrie is the best of High America, yeah, and you're about to see one of his great performances in that moment. I'll just say, like, of this film, and then we can open it up. You couldn't do this book with him if you were like a dyed-in-the-wool Jim Carrey fan, which I'm not like a fan. I'm not like a fanning person, but I'll never forget going with a friend who was to see Man on the Moon, and prior to that, I'd known him through In Living Color, and a great artist reinvents. And I think this is the film where my jaw dropped as a young person, saying, "Oh my God, an artist can do that." I loved him as Vanilla Ice on In Living Color, but that was a different thing. And I think our book was part of another reinvention. I've said this to Jim. I think that some of the best Jim Carrey roles are still to come.
And do you think that he can see this film again, or he's so Andy Kaufman in the film that he cannot see that someone made a film about
He's very, but they did the documentary, so I think he's definitely seen frames of it recently from the documentary. Yeah, it's a gorgeous performance.
Yeah.
Milos Forman, I think, named his two sons Jim and Andy after the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you can see Jim and Andy in Netflix or in everything. I tried to show it, but they didn't let me, and because they think that they have not good material to show in a theater. Anyway, but you can see, and it's after seeing the movie, if you see Jim and Andy, it will be a fantastic night. You'll have, And how is now? You are still working, not working, talking with him all the time.
He's a good friend, which is better.
Yeah.
There's no deadlines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's good. And
the book was born of conversation. I even at some point was like, we both have French Canadian fathers and like Norman Irish mothers, and I kind of like we might just be like cousins of some degree to explain like that. It was a 10-year conversation. DeLillo, your friend Don DeLillo says, in the names, conversation is the purest form of being. I'm getting it wrong, but it's something of that. And it's true, and conversation's powerful. And in this case, conversation made a book.
And you think that he will be back to the cinema or not?
That's a question for him to answer, but I've always said he's a great artist.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me. I don't want to think about a world where there aren't amazing performances to come. But I'd rather live in one where there are. I think we all would.
Yeah. Maybe you come with another name and another personality, something different.
There's a deep spirituality there, and America's strange. I think, and I don't want to speak for him, but there's a beautiful spirit there. Beautiful spirit, which is its own affair, which is its own drama, right? It's its own journey. St. Francis of Assisi it was controversial at the time, but when people say peace be with you was a radical statement made by St. Francis, because that was a glory-based culture. To say, may you have peace, meant that you wouldn't be part of the next war. I think, and I'll just say that. And it remains a radical statement. When someone just wants to have peace and to hear the birds, it still is a radical statement when they really mean it.
Someone wants to join us in the conversation?
Hi, guys. Can you talk about the first time you met Jim and your first impressions of the man?
I'll go first. I've never met him.
No, that's not true. You met him on FaceTime.
Yes, I met him in real life. I have a spectral relationship to him that's similar to the spectral relationship that many of you probably have.
I published a novel in 2007 and gone on all these waste of time meetings that you go on in Hollywood where you're talking to somebody who might have gotten an MBA or maybe has an MBA. And then they said, Jim wants to do something with the iPad. That was all they told me. You never know what the meeting's about. And I'm horrible at them because I'm not good at it. It's just draining. And so I went to meet him at his art studio, and I had been reading, I don't know, about the book, like the codex, just to, because there was no topic for the meeting. And I went in and I saw the paintings. And as I said, I thought about the Aeneid, which I had taken Latin in high school and over years translated line by line the Aeneid. Some of them I memorized and then was able to get an A on the test by regurgitating, but I always tried. And I thought of the Temple of Aphrodite in Carthage. I thought of that, and I encountered it.
Did you say that to him at the time when you met?
No, I mean, he's Jim. It's Jim Carrey. And it's an odd experience, right? And I don't live in L.A. Like, I mean, we're writers who live in Brooklyn, so it's not like you don't see celebrity. I mean, in New York, you don't, like, movie stars. America's a strange country because they're a continent away, right? But he was he was a wonderful conversationalist, and I mean, like Borges says that all the books that you're going to read have been laid out for you in a path when you're born, starting with the first book you read. And I think that it's an ongoing conversation. It's now a 12-year conversation. It was the beginning of a 12-year, I mean, it was incredible. It was a beautiful moment. And I think we both kind of wanted the same things, which was to, like, each in totally different places in our lives, but to make something pure with no one interfering. And I think we achieved, I mean, and I know we achieved that. And even right down to the
But we
point,
should also say it's fun.
and it's
It's not just, I mean, if people think that purity is only is a kind of asceticism or a kind of retreat, I mean, this book is really fun.
There's a section of the book where Kanye West believes that the aliens have made him the new Joseph, so he's going to be Yosef, and Kim Kardashian is going to be the new Virgin Mary, and they're going to have the star child. But what Kanye doesn't know is that Kim just got pregnant by someone in Palm Beach, and so he finds this out and starts crying. And like,
And this is before the latest Kanye West. In some ways, I mean, we can already see that this is a prescient book because this was before the latest Kanye West.
And like the best moments of writing the book were just reading this and laughing. We would laugh.
It's very, very funny, the book.
So,
I think it's, and you feel.
Oh, sorry. And then there's a great, and then, like the Jim Carrey difference is, like, in the original version of that, Kanye, he believed that in another dimension he's a quasar in draft one. Because I was about to throw this away because I thought you can't. I was like, I have this. It was like in longhand. He goes, man, that's great. In the original version, Kanye declared that in another dimension he was a quasar named Pete. And Jim's like, but that's just wrong because it's not crazy enough. And like, we stop work for 45 minutes, and at the end of it, Carrie goes, Cake. He's a quasar named Cake. And the difference between Pete and Cake is all the difference in the world.
Okay, it was a very good moment, and I hope that now people that doesn't know if Jim Carrey is a myth of reality, they will still don't know after our conversation.
It's both.
And thank you, and a good project. And for us, for the festival, it was something that I wanted to do for some time, because it's someone that not because only of Jim Carrey, but because of us that see their films. There is something that makes us, in a way, have a relation with ourselves differently. That when you see other films, that's why I really, I needed to do that. It was something that was important.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. And good projection. And we can see other films still, the Jim in Sintra in Lisbon, and maybe be attentive. Maybe there will be another discussion at the end, at another time, and with us, and we go on talking about. Okay.
Thank you, Bello.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.